Hi everyone, today I'm going to be looking at this Yongnuo 42.5 f1.7 prime lens for micro four thirds, and I'll be testing this on my Olympus cameras. But one of my viewers pointed this out to me right in the middle of a live stream, and when we looked at it on Amazon it was $92. So an f1.7 prime for $92, brand new. I think it's important to always compare a lens against a similar lens whenever you do a lens review, because there's so many reviews out there where they just kind of look at the lens all by itself, and it could be the best lens ever or the worst lens ever, but how do you know? I mean, compared to what, right? It's kind of like when, a parent says to their child, you're my favorite child, and the kid replies, well, I'm your only child, right? So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to compare the Olympus 45mm f1.8 against the Yongnuo 42.5 f1.7. Okay, first let's just look at the physical differences between these two lenses, and you can see the Yongnuo is quite a bit larger. It comes with a center pinch lens cap, which is nice, and it tells us here Yongnuo, and we have a 52mm filter ring thread, and these are plastic. And then on the Olympus, we have a 37mm filter ring thread, and again, these are also plastic. Going to the front of the lens, you can see that we have a little bit of a bevel here, but then on the Olympus, it's a little smoother, but this is actually what they call a beauty ring, because this will twist off like so, and you can attach an optional lens hood to the lens. However, you can just buy a 37mm lens hood like I did that screws into the front like so. These are like $5. And you would need to do the same for the Yongnuo, except just buy a 52mm size lens hood. Also on the side, the Yongnuo has a physical autofocus manual focus switch, whereas the Olympus does not. And then right here, we have our manual focusing ring, just like on the Olympus, and they both feel about the same. And just remember, these are all both plastic lenses basically. And the only other thing to note here is that it says made in China right here on the outside. Now going to the back of the lenses, let's remove our rear lens caps. And you can see that these are both metal lens mounts, which is nice. And the only thing to note here is that the Olympus says made in Vietnam, and on the Yongnuo we just have a serial number. All right, just for comparison, here's the Olympus 45mm on the EM5 Mark II, and as you can see, it's a very small lens on this camera, as it is on most cameras. And then the Yongnuo fits on very smoothly, and it's a little bigger, as you can see. But it's still a comfortable size, and it's very lightweight lens. So basically I'm going to do 3 or 4 tests. I'm going to do a portrait test using a flash. I have my Godox 8200 here, just shooting through an umbrella, and I put my little can cooler snoot on there. And I'm just going to be shooting right here against my white wall, just right behind me. And then, across all the different apertures, and we'll check for the autofocusing capability and the sharpness at different apertures and things like that, compared directly against the Olympus. Because I have had this lens a few days and I've got a feel for some of its strengths and weaknesses. So I set up my testing to kind of illustrate that to you, so you can make a better decision and see if this is the right lens for you. So I wanted to share with you what was going on during the testing here. And as you can see, the Olympus EM1 Mark III with the 45mm Olympus lens, the face detect and eye detect worked 100% with just a few dozen images I took here. I didn't have any problems in single point AF or continuous AF when I was doing this testing. However, when I put the Yongnuo lens on, the continuous AF with face and eye detect did not work at all. In fact, continuous AF just would not focus no matter what I did. So I didn't get any successful shots here. It was a total fail. However, in single point AF, the face and eye detect did work, but there were some misses there. So we'll look at those in a minute. Now, when I put the Yongnuo on EM5 Mark II, The SAF and the continuous AF, CAF, did work just fine with the face detect and eye detect. So it might have something to do with the EM5 Mark II is a contrast-only detect autofocus system, and the EM1 Mark III is a hybrid phase and contrast. All right, so let me just give you a quick summary of the results, and we'll look at a couple of them. But basically, with the Yongnuo, there was 41 shots between the two cameras, between single point AF and continuous AF, and out of that 41, 9 of them were clearly out of focus. The rest of them were either spot on or close enough. I couldn't really be sure, so I just gave it the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, so about a quarter of the pictures were out of focus, regardless of what mode or what camera I was using. With the exception of the M1 Mark III, it didn't autofocus at all in continuous autofocus for doing stills. All right, let's just take a quick look at some of the apertures. Here we are wide open with the Yongnuo on the left and the Olympus on the right. And I could not get the Yongnuo to autofocus properly at f1.7, and I tried over and over again. But clearly the Olympus is sharper here, but I can see that the Yongnuo, I think, just front focus just a tiny bit because it is fairly sharp right here in the image. Just like it is on the Olympus. But yeah, I couldn't compare them here at this aperture. Now at f2.8, let's do a comparison here. And you can see that at f2.8, the lenses are actually pretty close. I might give a slight edge to the Olympus, but yeah, not bad with the Yongnuo here. The only issue I'm seeing now, and this was pretty consistent, is that the Yongnuo is just a tiny bit redder in color than the Olympus. And again, it's easily fixed in post-processing, but it will render the images just a little bit more red on the Yongnuo lens. And then just one more here at f5.6. And yeah, the lenses are virtually equal in sharpness, but again, you'll see a difference here in the color rendering between the two cameras, and these are straight out of camera raws. All right, I'm going to do a pseudo landscape shot of my neighbor's tree over there. It's probably 70 to 100 meters away, and I'm going to just do 2 shots, one at normal resolution and then one in high-res shot mode on the M1 Mark III. All right, now looking at the landscape shots, wide open at f1.7 here on the Yongnuo and 1.8 on the Olympus, and you can see clearly the Olympus is much sharper. And again, I don't know if the Yongnuo is just missing focus, but it doesn't matter. I just could not get the Yongnuo to focus properly on the M1 Mark III. All right, stepping up to f2.8, much closer, but again, I would have to give the Olympus a much bigger edge here on the landscape side, more so than I saw on the portrait side when we were a lot closer. So at a distance, the Olympus is performing much better here. And then here at f5.6, actually I think both lenses now are equal. The Yongnuo has caught up to the Olympus, and it was pretty much like this throughout the rest of the aperture range. And then finally comparing in high-res shot mode at f5.6, pretty much equal. I'd still give the Olympus a little bit of an edge here on this branch. And if we go further down here on the trunk, you know, I can see a little bit more detail here on this little branch that was cut off versus here. It's a little bit softer. So again, the Olympus lens is sharper.
Sit. 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 Good girl. Stay.
All right, so I wanted to do some normal shooting, so I got some pictures of my dog here, and I think it did okay. It locked right on the eye, and I was in single point autofocus. It looks like it focused a little bit better over here, so maybe it did miss the eye just a tiny bit, but that could be user error. And the bokeh is very smooth and creamy, and the colors are fine. Like I said, they can be adjusted. I did do an auto white balance. And then here's another one. And if we punch in, you can see that it did nail the eye here. and that's what I was kind of going for. But now if you look at this one, again, I think, you know, I got really good. It nailed the focus. It was fine for just kind of normal shooting. It looked like it front focused a little bit here, but again, it might be just user error here because she was constantly moving. But what's really weird here is this little speckle here of bokeh. I don't know what caused this. If it's something internal into the lens, like the light's reflecting funny, or if there's a specular here in the background that the lens picked up on and just rendered it this way. So this is kind of weird. Maybe it's a ghost or something, you know, one of those orbs, but it was basically, if we go back to the other shots, you can see it a little bit behind her head here and a little bit behind her ear over here. It's just a weird spot. But in other shots, this one is weird, but you can see it keeps showing up. Now in this shot, it didn't show up, and we'll just do a quick punch. A little bit of purple fringing, but I did nail focus this time on the eye. And nice smooth bokeh, and it almost looks a little bit swirly here. And you'll see this more when we get to this shot here. See how the bokeh here are sort of an oval shape here in the corners? And then if we go to the next image, let's go to another one here. This one here. See how the bokeh is a little bit rounder here? The bokeh balls are a little bit rounder, but then as we get towards the edges, they start to stretch or elongate. So that is creating a slight swirly bokeh effect. And some people love that, some people hate it. You know, I like it a lot, actually. So I do like how it renders the bokeh. And, you know, for normal shooting, if we punch in, let that render, you'll see that I was easily nailing focus for the most part. You know, I wouldn't say I was doing better or worse than I would do with any other lens.
All right, so I'm going to do a continuous autofocus test between the two cameras, and I'm going to start on the EM5 Mark II with the Olympus 45mm f1.8. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk to and from this tree at 5 frames per second in continuous autofocus and see how many shots we get in focus. And that'll tell us that this lens is able to keep up with the continuous shutter mode, at least at 5 frames per second, which is the fastest mechanical shutter on the M5 Mark II. All right, it's definitely much slower performing. And part of the reason for that is not only is the autofocus motoring slower, but most likely the opening and closing of the aperture blades is also slower. So the motor for both functions, controlling the aperture and the shutter, the focusing, the motor's just very slow.
All right, so I'm just going to see how fast this lens will take pictures. So we're in high speed on the EM1 Mark III. So this will do 15 frames per second mechanical shutter, manual focus. So there shouldn't be anything interfering with this. But let's see how we do. And I'll just use 5 seconds on my watch here. And go. How many did we get there? We got 32 shots. All right. So that's roughly 6 or 7 frames per second out of 15. All right, let's do the Olympus. And we'll start on the 5-second mark. Okay, and how many did we get there? So we're at 104. So if we subtract 32, we get 72 shots. So that's closer to the 15 frames per second that the camera's capable of versus half that. We were only getting 6 or 7 frames. Here I'm just doing a quick autofocus test in video, and it didn't matter which camera I put the lens on, the Yongnuo just totally failed with continuous autofocus in video. And also the lens was very noisy. You could hear the focusing motors and the aperture clickety-clacking in the camera's internal mics. So if you do want to use this lens for video, it's going to have to be manual focus, fixed aperture, external mics recording. And then you'll be okay. But you can see the Olympus, even though it's the slowest autofocus lens I have for video of all the Olympus lenses, it still crushed the Yongnuo here. Okay, let's go over a couple of final details here. And I wanted to check the starburst and flaring of this lens. So I stopped it down to f22. And here I got a pretty nice starburst from the sun. There is a little bit of flaring going on. You can see some purple and green right in here in the middle. And then up here at the top, there's a big green blob up here, but I would be pretty happy with this, honestly, for my own personal photography. But I moved over to the left a little bit, and you can see that the flaring and the purple-green blobs are just getting worse and worse. And then finally, when the sun is pointing directly into the lens, you still get that starbursty effect, but I think the green flaring and purple flaring is pretty bad here, and I may not use this image for fun even. And then finally, the lens has a close focusing distance of 0.3 meters, and the Olympus 45mm has a close focusing distance of 0.5 meters. So I just focused here on my watch here at f2.2. And if we do a comparison, you can see that it does get quite a bit closer than the Olympus in terms of how much it magnifies. And if we just punch in and look at the detail, you can see that the contrast and probably the sharpness of the Olympus is just a little better, as we've been seeing throughout the testing here. But I just wanted to show you the difference between the two lenses in terms of close focusing. If you want to do close-up photography, you'll get slightly better results maybe with the Yongnuo. So here are my final thoughts on this lens. If you haven't already decided from all the testing I've done, is don't buy this lens. It's just your money will be much better spent if you can save up, a couple $100 and get the Olympus 45mm, because they sell between $200 and $300 all day long, depending on how you shop. And it's mainly because this lens has too many problems. I mean, the build quality is okay, but the autofocusing is just bad. I was only getting a 75–80% hit rate on just the simplest shots, like, doing portraits or taking pictures of my dog. And then another problem is the lens is very slow. The autofocusing motors are slow, and in particular, the aperture blade motor is slow if it's not the same motor. Because you could see that on the EM5 Mark II, you could hear it. It was much slower, going from 5 frames per second on the Olympus lens down to probably just 2 or 3 frames with the Yongnuo. And then on the M1 Mark III, you can see I was getting 15 frames per second on the Olympus 45mm, but only about 6 or 7 frames per second when I used the Yongnuo. So it's cutting the speed of the camera down to half. If you're trying to do any kind of burst shooting, sports action type stuff. And then finally, for video, it's almost completely useless. No matter what camera I use, the EM1s, the EM5, I even tested everything on my GX85, the Panasonic. I could not get the continuous autofocus to work and lock in on my face. Even when I gave it a little help and refocused it, which I didn't show in the testing, but it would lock on for that 1 second, and then it would lose me almost as quickly as soon as I moved. So the only way you can do video with this lens is if you're doing manual focus, and also if you are doing recording audio externally, because the lens is very noisy. The aperture blades make a terrible clackety sound, and the focusing motor has kind of a hum to it even when it's not focusing, and a little ticking sound that gets picked up by the internal mics. So again, it makes it almost useless for video unless you're recording manually in manual focus and recording externally the audio. But even then, I'm not so sure it's worth it for that, because it's just not a video focal length anyway. So those are my final thoughts. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, consider subscribing to the channel, hitting the like button, buy me a coffee. But either way, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.